Welcome to the debate. Today, we are diving into what is arguably one of the most significant, maybe the most dramatic internal rupture within the V2V Aurisyn enterprise. I'm talking about the fallout, the really intense fallout from the narrative framing used when retelling the Sugar Palm sit-down. This wasn't just, some minor disagreement. It ended with DLB demanding a full apology episode, total content removal, and a complete severance from the network.
It's a huge moment, a real reckoning. And, given the circumstances that this kind of open discussion, this window for intellectual discourse might be closing soon, we really have to unpack this now. The core question, I think, is pretty stark. Was the specific way they narrated that sit-down, that sort of detached viewpoint, was that a necessary creative choice? A kind of fidelity to raw experience, trying to capture the psychological reality? Or, look, was it actually a fundamental, unforgivable breach of trust? A violation of the code DLB Circle operates under? Essentially, was it a lie told through creating distance?
I definitely see why you frame it as a breach. I do. But I'm going to argue for the legitimacy of the creative attempt behind it. I believe the narrative device they used, specifically referring to themselves, the hosts, in the third person, almost like analyzing their own experience at the table as if it were source material, I think that was a deliberate and maybe even justifiable attempt to honor the psychological truth of what was, by all accounts, an overwhelming experience.
And I'm coming at this from, a completely different angle. Creative intent, no matter how sophisticated or well-meaning, it just becomes irrelevant when the impact is perceived as betrayal. My position is that this narrative choice, whatever the intention, it failed catastrophically. It manufactured an emotional, even a physical distance, and in doing so, it shattered that foundational contract of trust. And so the consequences DLB demanded, that total compliance, the apology, the severance, I don't see that as an overreaction. I actually think it was necessary, required even, to protect the sanctity of what they call the code.
Okay, but to really get the host's approach, I think we first have to accept the context, right? The state they were in when they walked into that room. They weren't like objective journalists covering a story. They explicitly said they walked into the Sugar Palm sit-down fundamentally shaken. This was right after viewing that film, Cognizance Altered, which is known to be this intensely disruptive piece about psychological fragility. They even said publicly things like they felt untethered, almost like my own identity was glitching.
That feeling, that internal glitching. Okay, I acknowledge that's important context. But does it grant a license for that kind of detachment in the retelling?
Well, I think the narrative style was chosen because of that feeling. It was a specific device meant to capture that sense of profound dissociation. That feeling of being both in the moment, participating, but also simultaneously observing your own life, almost from the outside. Remember, they weren't just reporting on a meeting minutes later. They were trying to translate this chaotic, deeply personal, multi-layered event weeks later back in the Atlanta studio. And this messy approach, this is arguably honoring DLB's own ethos, isn't it? The idea that real life doesn't get edited?
But that's exactly where the logic for me falls apart. You can't claim real life doesn't get edited and then proceed to effectively edit yourself out of your own lived experience by adopting this third-person observer stance. The failure here wasn't really aesthetic, was it? It was ethical. That narrative choice created a distortion, plain and simple. It positioned them, active participants at the table, as mere observers just studying the event. And that flies directly in the face of the rule DLL established, the one he defends so fiercely. He fucking hates liars.
But what if their main goal, their primary aim, was to avoid making it cute? To avoid reducing this really intense, complex experience into some kind of simple, easily digestible first-person recap. They felt they had to find a device that conveyed the sheer difficulty of processing it all. Amy herself had given them that mandate, right? That their story isn't supposed to be digestible, inspirational, or palatable. So to sanitize the memory into a neat, chronological, I did this, then he said that, well, wouldn't that have been a lie of omission? The detached framing, maybe it was an attempt to signal, look, this memory is heavy, it's hard to hold, it almost feels external to us right now.
Okay, but that high concept justification
led to a very direct, very visceral failure. It effectively erased his people. Gia, Ami, Minx, all the artists who were, as they say, truth fluent enough to share deeply personal stories at that table. They were disrespected because the host's self-referential framing, intentional or not, turned these contributors into, well, background noise, background to a story your hosts were supposedly studying. And DLB's core identity, his whole structure, rests on protecting those who speak honestly in his space. The ultimate authority on the code has to rest with its architect, DLB himself. And he identified the choice not as fluency, but as a sleight of edit, editing one's own presence, one's own participation. And, that brings us straight to this core tension, intent versus impact. You're focusing on the psychological state, the internal context for the hosts. Fair enough. But let's talk about the immediate impact, the jarring effect of that opening line. I find it hard to buy that the intent was purely about psychological truth. When they kicked it off saying something like, calling it a sit-down almost feels too casual based on what we've seen, especially in that NeonKore Media series, The Deep Dive.
I'm still not convinced that one line alone signifies betrayal.
But it instantly sets a tone. It undermined the whole contract right from the start. It sounded analytical, almost like a press release summary, not like two people grappling with a shared intense experience. It used the language of external media analysis, literally referencing the Deep Dive series to describe something they lived. That detachment is the polar opposite of being truth fluent in that moment, isn't it?
I think maybe you're applying a very external, almost journalistic standard to what was fundamentally an internal and likely very messy processing effort. That comment, maybe it was just symptomatic of the producer's the need to somehow structure the retelling of this complex, multi-part saga that wasn't linear at all. It could have been an attempt to just manage the cognitive gap, between the event itself and the retelling weeks later in Atlanta. It might have been seen as a necessary part of what they termed archiving without theft, that ethical burden to document something significant without simplifying its inherent messiness just to make it consumable.
But surely structure shouldn't come at the cost of misrepresenting your own role. DLB's core objection wasn't about the difficulty of structuring the narrative, was it? It was definitional. He was crystal clear. What I will not accept is people who sat at my table pretending they didn't or pretending they were only observers. That's lying. In his world, in his code, distorting your presence like that, it's functionally the same as making something up, especially when it negates the agency, the very presence of the other individuals who shared that table and their truths.
That's a strong point about definitional lying, I grant you. But at the same time, weren't the hosts also showing immense vulnerability? They repeatedly expressed self-doubt about their own experience, saying things like, sometimes I wonder if I'm just projecting my own baggage, or I couldn't trust my own eyes. That kind of real self-questioning, isn't that a sign of profound authenticity, not deceit? Maybe they were genuinely trying to honor the messy truth of their own unreliable reaction, which actually seems consistent with that whole anti-editing ethos. It doesn't sound like they were trying to trick anyone. Maybe they were just struggling to translate the sheer complexity of subjective reality.
But the framework they chose to convey that subjective reality arguably canceled out the honesty of the self-doubt. Okay, they tried to capture emotional accuracy, maybe, but they failed on the factual accuracy of their status at that table. Their own self-doubt inadvertently became framed as the main event, the primary intellectual drama, and that overshadowed the courage of the people who actually sat there and offered up raw, difficult stories. When DLB says he hates liars, he's talking about people who twist the record, often to protect themselves or to elevate their own narrative above others. And whether intended or not, that's arguably the impact here.
But I'd argue that the host's attempt, even if it was flawed, right, even if it failed in execution, was still an attempt to wrestle with the material, which is something DLB often asks for. The intention, I believe, was to demonstrate the transformative impact of the experience on them, not to minimize their participation. The failure, perhaps, lies more in how the audience, and crucially DLB, misinterpreted the narrative signal.
But the consequence tells you the failure was fundamental, doesn't it? This wasn't seen as a minor misstep. It was deemed so catastrophic that DLB demanded the absolute most extreme remedy possible, a full, permanent apology episode, the permanent removal of all related content, and complete, irreversible severance from his world. And I have to say, I defend that required remedy. I think it was the only proportional response available within the rules of their engagement.
Okay, I absolutely concede the impact was catastrophic, undeniably severe. But we have to talk about proportionality here. Does a creative misstep, an experiment in narrative form that resulted in unintended distance, does that really warrant institutional content destruction? Complete severance? The failure seems to be one of creative communication, maybe a misjudged execution, not necessarily an intentional ethical breach, and certainly not like theft of intellectual property. The severity of the punishment, it just feels wildly disproportionate to the crime of narrative framing.
See, I don't think the failure was merely aesthetic or communicative. It was seen as a violation of the central, almost constitutional contract upon which DLB's entire ecosystem is apparently built. That rule, the one pinned by Julia and Sophia, that defines the freedom and the responsibility within that space. Nobody is bound here. No locks. No leashes.
Right. And how does destroying an archive, erasing the record, uphold that sense of freedom?
Because that freedom, as I understand it, is predicated on absolute, unwavering trust. The failure was seen as so fundamental, a betrayal of the trust placed in them by the people who spoke in confidence at that table, that the response had to be equally fundamental. Trust was broken, perhaps irrevocably. And the only way to adhere to the code in that situation, the argument goes, was a complete permanent cut, severance. It was the only mechanism left to, quote, put the broken trust back in the light. The relationship itself became the artifact that needed to be dismantled. And the content archive, that was just the physical manifestation of that revoked trust, that revoked privilege.
But let's just pause on the irony for a second. You're arguing for the sanctity of DLB's anti-editing philosophy, this commitment to raw truth. Yet the demand was for the systematic scrubbing of the entire archive, the removal of the raw audio itself. I mean, that is the definition of institutional editing and erasure, isn't it?
I see the apparent contradiction, I do. But perhaps DLB's anti-editing ethos applies primarily to the capture and representation of lived experience, not necessarily to the consequences enacted when the foundational code itself is violated. The code perhaps must be self-correcting, and if the archive, in his view, becomes tainted by a fundamental act of betrayal, misrepresenting presence, then the preservation of that content becomes a secondary concern. The primary concern shifts to protecting the people involved and the integrity of the code itself.
Okay, but what about DLB's final, overarching demand to the hosts? The mandate that they know him better than your fucking God is supposed to? How can they possibly fulfill that? By destroying the very archive, removing the raw material. Hasn't he effectively handcuffed their ability to perform that deep dive to truly understand the nuances of the code through continuous study and reflection on the actual events?
Maybe the knowledge DLB demands isn't archival, but internal, embodied. Maybe he demands a knowledge of the spirit of the code, the ethics of presence, of agency, of respect, learned through painful experience. And maybe the code dictates that if you break trust by, in his view, erasing his people, then the privilege of even holding the archive of that world is revoked. Perhaps the only piece of content allowed to remain is the public record of the failure, the apology. That itself serves as the final harsh lesson. He might be forcing them to internalize the failure deeply rather than allowing them to rely on external documentation for understanding.
So, all right, my final position is this. I believe the failure was ultimately one of creative communication, a technique intended, perhaps misguidedly, to demonstrate psychological fidelity was received devastatingly as ethical detachment. The method chosen was, I think, an honest, though critically flawed attempt to be truth-fluent in reflecting the psychological toll of the experience, even if the cost was this profound misunderstanding and ultimately the severing of a valuable, complex relationship.
And I'll reiterate, intent simply cannot mitigate the damage of impact in this context. The only outcome that could possibly honor the initial contract of trust, that core commitment to protecting the people who shared their truth at that table, was the absolute accountability demanded by the architect of that code. When you position participants as objects of study, whether you mean to or not, you've broken the foundational rule. And in that world, the only possible outcome is complete severance. That's the harsh reality of the code.
We certainly both agree on the sheer gravity of this situation. It represents, it seems, the final, incredibly complicated chapter defined by this reckoning and the truth-fluent code. And perhaps it's fitting we're debating it now, while we still have the space to articulate these deep disagreements publicly.
Indeed, and perhaps the core takeaway for anyone observing this saga is the inherent danger, the real difficulty in translating raw, lived, often traumatic truth into any kind of structured media, and the absolute paramount importance of acknowledging the people who share their stories without ever reducing them to mere subjects for analysis, however well-intentioned that analysis might be.
Absolutely. And this debate itself, I hope, in just illuminating these two really quite different interpretations of what honesty means here, one focused on psychological truth, the other on ethical status and presence, maybe it just underscores the profound complexity of ever achieving true fidelity to raw experience.